There was this golden age of American Jewry in the post-war period when Judaism moved into the mainstream. Jews felt comfortable. They moved into workplaces that had been denied them in the past. And there was a clear diminution of antisemitism. We're moving into something new. We don't know how it's going to develop exactly, and we don't know how it will impact on conversions. But in general, in periods when anti-Semitism has been fierce, there have been fewer conversions. And that golden age made it comfortable, very comfortable for non-Jews to move into the Jewish world, just as it made it comfortable for Jews to move into a non-Jewish world. It was just a period in which being Jewish was fine, not being Jewish was fine, and I think that could change.
Welcome to this episode of Your People Will Be My People, Conversion in a Post-October 7th World. This podcast is sponsored by Project Ruth. Project Ruth, founded in 2023, formalizes Orthodox affiliation for Jews of diverse and varied backgrounds and welcomes those seeking Orthodox conversion to find meaningful connection to and understanding of Jewish life and practice. I am Rabbi Adam Mintz, founder and president of Project Ruth. I am here with my partner in the podcast, Meredith Berkman, community activist and leader within the Jewish community. And today we have the treat to interview or to be joined by Professor Miriam Bodian. Professor Bodian, who most recently was a professor in the Department of History at the University of Texas in Austin, is the author of a volume called Conversion, from the Keywords in Jewish Studies series, which she will be able to talk to us about. But a little closer to home, at least for us living in New York, she is the co-curator, full disclosure, with my wife Sharon, of an exhibition at the Jewish Theological Seminary Library on 122nd Street and Broadway called Your People Shall Be My People. What a good title. Conversion to Judaism Through the Centuries. So Miriam, why don't you start by telling us, just introduce yourself. Tell us about the book. Tell us about the exhibition. So tell us what got you interested in this topic.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that while there were aspects of my career that got me involved with conversion in important ways, that's not what brought me to the study of Jewish history. And so, full disclosure on my part, I am a convert. And for me, there were sort of two important moments. And one was something like the discovery of my own anti-Semitism. I came from a family with my father was Jewish, his family was Jewish, did not know that growing up. And his sister informed me of that at some point in my adolescence. And I think that suppression in the family of anything, I can't even remember the word Jew or Jewish being used. And we lived in a strictly non-Jewish neighborhood. I'm not sure whether there was a restrictive covenant, but there may well have been until the 60s. And I absorbed that this was something, unpleasant and negative in some way. And after college, almost by accident, I found myself reading a book that transformed my understanding, and that was Pirkei Avot, with an English translation, of course. And as my friend who recommended it to me said, it's not what you think. And he meant Judaism is not what you think. And so I think my main interest in historical studies was anti-Semitism and the sort of survival and evolution of Jewish religion, Jewish culture. And the way my conversion played a role had to do with the topic I was working on, or which I came to work on, which was the history of the Conversos of Spain and Portugal. The very word converso means convert, and they had a very complicated history. And I felt strongly at the time that my own experience of conversion made me question the way this was being presented in the historical literature. I'll give you an example of a phrase that was used that when the Conversos escaped the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal and settled in Amsterdam or Venice, they threw off the cloak of Catholicism. So, as someone who had gone through a very lengthy process of internal conversion, this was ridiculous. You don't throw off the cloak of one identity and assume another sort of instantaneously. So, that was something that drew me in, that I had something to say about a conception that was quite widespread in the literature up to that point. Why did I write a book about conversion? Well, because two editors at the University of Rutgers Press asked me if I would. And they asked me if I would because I had spent my career studying a population that converted in different ways. They were forcibly converted to Catholicism. Some of them assimilated and then later became crypto Jews. So there was that kind of conversion, or they left the peninsula, went to lands where they could practice Judaism and had to undergo a kind of conversion to rabbinic Judaism about which they knew nothing, even if they were fervent crypto Jews. So that's how I got involved.
So I just want to say something. I just returned from winter holidays visit with my entire family from Portugal. And because of it's today, I put on this large silver Jewish star that I found in an antique market in Portugal. Now, it was a thing of like silver stuff thrown together, and it was mostly crosses and other Christian artifacts. And then there was this big Jewish star. So I asked the woman about it, and she said, "Oh, I think it's from the 1950s." I said, "Oh, it's Jewish." And she goes, "Yes, it's a Jewish cross." So while by the 1950s, things were very, very different, but traveling through Portugal and knowing not even a fraction of what you have devoted your life to studying, I was extremely moved to find this star, which for all I know, was maybe someone who was escaping the Holocaust and came through Portugal, or just someone, perhaps it's actually modern and it was put there for a tourist like me to find. It didn't seem so at the time, but it's possible. But anyway, I have been wearing.
Meredith, how much did they charge you?
Well, my husband listens to our podcast, so I'll have to tell you offline. How's that? He's a big fan, but it was not an enormous amount of money, but it was nothing. I mean, she tested it. It is silver. It's hard to see, but it has some very pretty designs. And I know that this style is a sort of an older style, but I wore it in Portugal so proudly because I was so aware of the past. And in fact, I'm sure you've been many, many times, but in Porto, a guide took me actually to, there's like an old age home. What's the Yiddish term? Moshe Zakenu, an old age home where they had discovered like a hidden ark that someone had removed the Torah from, the crypto Jews. But anyway, I wasn't thinking when I put this on today about your book and that it was relevant, but it's extremely moving to me, even if it's a tourist curio, to know that it was bought in Portugal and that I was proud to buy it because it represented the rebirth of Jews in Portugal and, of course, and around the world. So I'm fascinated by that.
Who would have thought, Miriam, that was what was going to pull you together at an antique store in Porto?
Right.
There's so much to talk about, obviously, in your journey and in your academic work and in your recent work on conversion. Let's start with fun. Who is the most interesting convert who you studied?
That's a difficult question. And let me say, I won't refer to modern cases because they're more complicated. But I think probably if I had to choose one, you're putting me on the spot, I would say Warder Cresson.
Okay, what? That's an amazing story. Why don't you tell everybody that story?
Yeah, so this is an American story. Warder Cresson was from a Quaker family in Philadelphia, and
What year?
he lived in the first half of the 19th century. I think he died in 1860. He became acquainted with Isaac Leeser, who at the time was a very important rabbi, publicist, journalist in Philadelphia. And as a Quaker who was becoming more and more disaffected with his own faith, he was drawn to the interest, Isaac Leeser's interest in Palestine and the Jewish question. In his time, this was a period of a revival of religious interest in the United States generally. And some of you may be familiar with Mordechai Manuel Noah, whom he also knew, who was a Jew, a Jewish restorationist who's often called a proto-Zionist, which I don't like. But he was a Jewish restorationist. He wanted the Jews to return to Palestine. He was interested in what was happening geopolitically, the alignment that made it look like a possibility, something that Herzl later recognized. And he left his family in Philadelphia and went to Palestine, where he converted, took the name Michael Boaz Israel, and I guess for family reasons, he returned to Philadelphia, where he was put on trial. Who put him on trial? It was his wife and family members who wanted him tried for insanity. I assume for pecuniary reasons, right? If he could be declared insane, he had no claim on any of the family property. In any case, it became a kind of spectacular trial because it seemed as if what was being put on trial was Judaism. That is, was converting to Judaism evidence of a psychiatric problem? That was sort of the question hanging around it. And Warder Cresson's lawyer convincingly argued the case, and that no, conversion to Judaism was not a psychiatric condition. So he was relieved of that problem, but he had many others. He left for Palestine with the aim of establishing an agricultural colony in, some of you may recognize the name, in Emek Rephaim in Jerusalem. It didn't come to fruition, but it was a very interesting sort of dovetailing of different forces that brought him to convert.
Do we know at that time in America, what were conversion rates to Judaism? I'm going to be spending this somewhat cold, snowy day now looking to see if I can find New York Times articles that are contemporaneous with the trial. That's fascinating. But were there?
I would recommend looking at the Occident. I would look at Isaac Leeser's journal, The Occident, where there was a long article about the trial.
I will. Thank you. What were the conversion rates at that point? Do you know that, or is that something that was publicly available, or historically available in retrospect? Like, how common was it?
We don't have statistics, but it was fairly common for marriage. Almost always for marriage. And until the 1840s, there were really no rabbis in the United States. It was only when the German immigration began that rabbis arrived, and so it was all very informal. A synagogue board could perform a conversion, and so the change comes in 1840. Still, there are no statistics, but all of the evidence shows that the main reason, and also ketubot. If you look at ketubot, where status as a convert has to be mentioned, you can see that mostly women, and in one case, we have the conversion certificate, which came 5 months before marriage to a Jew, and So at least in that case, it's very clear what the background to the conversion was.
But those numbers are in the tens, not in the hundreds, the numbers of converts. You're talking very few because there are very few Jews in America at that time.
Right. I mean, it changes in the 1840s with the German
Right.
immigration, but yes, before
Right.
that, of course, before that, very few, yes.
Right. Okay. So, first of all, the Warder Cresson story is amazing. Now, you have something from Warder Cresson in the exhibition at JTS. What is that? You have a book?
It's a book, it's one of his books in which he tries to prove that Judaism is the true religion and Christianity is a false religion. And they are fairly, I would say, extreme. Even the illustrations, the illustration in that's open in the exhibition shows the episode in which King Solomon is forced to decide which is the mother. And for Warder Cresson, he saw Judaism and Christianity everywhere. And here he saw Christianity was the false mother, and Judaism was the mother who agreed to give up the baby because she wanted to save the baby. So that's the page that's open. His writing is sort of florid and not what we would consider the kind of language you would use if you're addressing an audience of people with different persuasions. But it's certainly very interesting. You can see he has some of the characteristics of, you can understand perhaps why he was put on trial for insanity.
Okay. It wasn't so strange that his wife claimed that he was insane.
He was a very
Wasn't
passionate,
so surprising.
sort of overly passionate person, yes.
I always
Okay.
thought it was a very Jewish thing for a wife to claim her husband was insane, but maybe that's just me. So you put you on the spot, and Adam has asked you, who is the most interesting convert of all of the objects? And I'm very excited to go to see the exhibition. Of all of the objects in the exhibition, what is for you the most surprising or exciting, or what is the most resonant for you as a historian, as a convert? Are they one and the same?
Well, I think the material from the Geniza, for someone who's interested in ancient documents, it's really extraordinary to have these documents from the 11th to 13th centuries that are evidence one way or another of conversion. They're all sort of located in the medieval section of the exhibition. It's designed by period. And among them are letters of recommendation for converts. And I might just mention that, to convert in the medieval period, wherever you were under Islam or under Christianity, was an offense that was punishable theoretically by death. And so very often converts would flee their place of residence. If they were Christians, they often fled to Muslim lands, losing their homes, losing their way of making a living. And so it's understandable that they would be in need of letters of recommendation for financial aid.
Why would somebody, if you were living in a Christian country or Christian town in the first century of the second millennium, so you want to convert to Judaism? Why would someone want to convert to Judaism? You said in America people converted for marriage. Why did they convert in the medieval period in Germany or France?
So one of the things that's striking about the material we have, and of course it's not necessarily representative, is the number of men who are either nobles or clerics or both. And I think it tells us a lot. The medieval period was one of intense religious confrontation. Both Islam and Christianity are sort of absolutist religions. You are an infidel if you aren't a believer. And so conversion to Judaism, whether under Islam or under Christianity, was punishable. So why would anybody? Yes, why would anybody do that? Given the not just the danger of converting, but also the situation Jews were in with special taxes and the threat of violence and so on. Why would they do that? And what we have for at least a number of very interesting converts is in some cases explicit, but in others you can sort of read between the lines that they're educated, and that means they read the Bible. And they're aware, they may very well be aware of Christian Jewish polemics in which Jews make arguments that the law has not been abrogated. Look at this verse. And Jesus is not the Messiah. Look at this verse. And the Jews are forever the people of God. Look at this verse. And that apparently was troubling and led to the belief that, in fact, the Jews were right. They had the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, and who better to understand than the Jews? But even in the Latin translation, these verses seem to throw into question some of the most basic of Christian doctrines. So that at least is one type of convert in medieval period.
What would be the time that it would take? I mean, I sent Adam last night. There's a comedian, a funny Israeli American comedian named Modi. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he did a shtick about conversion and saying, if it were up to me, the person, all they have to do is get on a flight from New York to Tel Aviv, middle seat, economy, and fly back and forth. And it was hilarious. But now today, obviously there's a certain amount of study or, and it depends, I suppose, on the kind of conversion. What would have been the prerequisites for a conversion, for example, as you described in the medieval period?
Well, but by the late Gaonic period, by the 10th, 11th centuries, the Talmud was the undisputed authoritative text for Jews, and the procedure is laid out quite specifically in the tractate Yevamot. So we assume that most medieval conversions followed that procedure, although there's one very striking case that became part of a court case in which there's quite a deviation from that norm. But technically, the potential convert was to come before a Beit Din, a religious court, and would be warned of the risks of becoming a Jew and instructed in basic halachot. But I should emphasize basic. The Talmud is very clear about this, that it shouldn't be too onerous, the demands on the convert and the halachot that are being taught. Then, if it's a male, he would be circumcised. Then, both after that, the male and the female would be immersed, and they would be declared an Israelite in every way, Israel b'chol davar. So that's the basic procedure.
Do you have examples of people who then decided that they were no longer Jewish in the exhibition or in your own, writing? I've discussed this with my children, and I've said, well, if you're a convert, you become Jewish. You could then become the Pope, but you're still Jewish, right? That it's So, are there examples historically of people who converted and then decided, oh, I made a mistake, I'm no longer Jewish? And in fact, I should ask Adam, is that notion true? That this is going to, please, I hope you'll forgive me for being glib, but, there was that old, in the 70s, the Roach Motel, you can get in, but you can't get out. And I once said to my son, well, that's what Judaism is. You're born Jewish. It doesn't matter who you think you are, you're still Jewish. And I wonder if that's the same for converts, and then that's for Adam, and then for you, Miriam, do we have examples of that you've come across and or that are in the exhibition or in your book?
So that is true. The Talmudic phrase is Yisrael af al pi shechata Yisraelu, that a Jew, once you're a Jew, even if you sin, even if you leave Judaism, you're still Jewish. You can be buried in the Jewish cemetery. But I'm interested in the history. Miriam, what's the history of people who convert and who then want to revert back to their original religion?
Well, the Talmud actually alludes to that and makes clear that you don't lose, even if you're a convert, you don't lose your status as a Jew. You become an apostate, like any Jew who converts out. There's certainly many, of course, many cases of Jews who converted to either Christianity or Islam. I don't offhand know of stories of converts, given the situations that you see these people get, either great poverty or the loss of their family, loss of their hometown. Um, you would expect that the same thing that happens with Jews who convert and come back happened with converts as well.
So what you really set up, Miriam and Meredith, and we really have here is that there's a difference. There's Warder Cresson, and then there's the person in the year 1050. So they both seem to convert for religious reasons, right? They think that Judaism is preferable to Christianity. It's more true than Christianity. But you also said, Miriam, that in America, and obviously that was true 150 years ago, and it's more true now, that many slash most people who convert to Judaism convert because of a partner, either a real partner or a potential partner, but they convert for a Jewish partner.
Right, Adam, you said that you see that in your own work, correct?
Right, and I see that in my own work. And that wasn't true in the year 1050 because you had much more to lose. First of all, that social scenario didn't create itself. So therefore it didn't happen that way. So you see that there's a movement in terms of reasons for conversion. There still were the Warder Cressons of the world, but most people converted for the sake of a partner. And then we come to the 21st century, to today. And I know that historians are not prophets, so we're not allowed to talk about the future, but we can talk about the present. In terms of these trends, what have you seen about the modern trends in terms of reasons for conversion? And how do you see that? How did your study of history help you understand the modern the modern reasons for conversions?
I don't know if my study of history did really help me to understand the modern case. I mean, it's so tied up with modernizing trends in general, assimilation, the decay of communal authority, secularization.
Why didn't you start with 1970? Why don't you take us through from 1970 to 2026 to understand what were some of the issues that led to an increase in terms of the number of conversions? And then I'll tell you what my experience has been.
Okay, I don't know if why you choose 1970. You might.
I made it up. You're welcome to choose another date.
I would choose 1948 because of the establishment of the State of Israel and the
Good. Take it away.
and the role of the chief rabbinate in establishing the halakhic status of converts. So there's an Israeli world that develops its own dynamics in terms of conversion, and there's the United States, the largest diaspora community by far, that has a very different set of of conditions. So if I would compare them, I mean, in the United States, with its guarantee, at least so far, of religious freedom, there's no governmental control over conversion at all, and the the American streams of Judaism have to try to work it out among themselves or not, what they're going to do given the differences in the way they perform conversion, their expectations, and so on. And if I would venture to think about what's changed or what's changing in the American scene right now, I'm reminded of an interview you did with Jeannie Suk Gerson, who wrote an article in the New Yorker in which she mentioned that something that she was already involved with Judaism, but something that really encouraged her, prompted her to go ahead and go through with the conversion was October 7th, which, I found surprising. And it reminded me a little bit of non-Jews who converted in the wake of the Holocaust in Poland, in Germany, partly because they identified with the Jewish people and what had happened to them, and drew close to them, and eventually that became their world.
Excuse me, can I ask a question, Miriam? So was there an increase in Europe, at least, of conversion to Judaism after the Holocaust?
Yes, in some places, in Poland and Germany in particular, at least I've seen articles on that subject. So I have to ask myself the question: there was this golden age of American Jewry in the post-war period when Jews moved into the mainstream, Judaism moved into the mainstream. Jews felt comfortable. They moved into workplaces that had been denied them in the past, and there was a clear diminution of anti-Semitism. We're moving into something new. We don't know how it's going to develop exactly, and we don't know how it will impact on conversions. But in general, in periods when anti-Semitism has been fierce, there have been fewer conversions. And that golden age made it comfortable, very comfortable for non-Jews to move into the Jewish world, just as it made it comfortable for Jews to move into a non-Jewish world. It was just a period in which being Jewish was fine, not being Jewish was fine, And I think that could change. I think it may be changing.
So let's take what Miriam just said and let's put dates to it. Yes, I said I made up the dates. Let's put dates to it for a minute. In 1925, if a Jewish man met a non-Jewish woman, it would have been easier for the Jewish man to just leave Judaism. Forget convert to Christianity. I don't know if he converted or he didn't convert, but just leave Judaism, because what's the point, right? Why does he, the non-Jew is not going to become Jewish because the Jews are on the margins, but the Jew can become an American. I always say it that way. Before 1950, before 1948, the Jewish man didn't convert to Christianity. He converted to Americanism. And that was what was important, because he wasn't really an American. He was Jewish. They tell the story in my grandmother's family. She came from a rabbinic family that moved to the Lower East Side. And there was one brother. And one day he disappeared and they never heard from him again. And the story in the family, obviously there's no data, but the story of the family is that he met a non-Jewish woman and he became American and he just left the family. So it was much easier to become American. And then, Miriam, you talk about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, when Jews entered the mainstream, the golden age of American Jewry. They entered the mainstream. They entered the public sphere, right? It was okay to take off from work early on Friday afternoon. They became politicians. We each have our own stories about how we know that the Jews finally made it. And all of a sudden, it was okay. If the Jewish man is going out with a non-Jewish woman, at the very least, Miriam, it's a tie. Right? At the very least, well, he can become American, but he doesn't need to become not Jewish to be American. He's Jewish and he's American. So it would be more reasonable that he insisted that she become Jewish. What am I saying that's wrong?
Nothing you're saying is wrong, but one thing I would would look at is, I think in the post-war period, American Jews identified with American values. They also tended to be urban, cosmopolitan, and leftist, and leaning left. And I think that's changing. And it's changing partly because the left is ideologically changing in the United States. It has been gradually since the Six-Day War, but certainly in a much more obvious way since October 7th. And so I think there's less feeling of being comfortable as and identifying Jewish values with American values. I don't think we know where this is going to go, but I do think that's a shift and that American Jews are feeling it.
Oh, so you okay, that's interesting. I wasn't talking about American values. I was kind of making a socioeconomic point. And that is that you could, starting in the 60s, the 50s and 60s and 70s, you could be a Jew and you could have, you could be a partner in a law firm, you could be a doctor, you were accepted at Harvard Law School. All of a sudden you could become part of economic America. And therefore you could be comfortable. So therefore you didn't have to leave Judaism to be comfortable. You're talking about something else, which is American values. It's interesting. I obviously work with a lot of converts. I don't hear that from anybody. Now, it is true that more of my converts are identified American left than American right. But Miriam, that's just because most of my converts are younger. That's not a function. That doesn't tell you anything more that many of them are just young New Yorkers, right? They come from Brooklyn. They voted like 85% from Mamdani. So that doesn't tell you much other than that. But what's interesting is, let me just talk about a couple of things. Number one is October 7th. You said you were surprised that G.D. Cresson saw October 7th as a reason to convert. Now, but you just said that the Germans and the Poles, they identified with the Jews and they converted after the Holocaust. Yes, some. So the same thing is some here.
But I would also expect that there are American non-Jews who would be more reluctant, given the current political atmosphere, who would be more reluctant to convert today than they were, during what I'm calling the golden age.
Okay, 2 points about that. This is not going to be our conversation because Meredith and I have agreement that this is not our conversation. But Ivanka proves that that's not true. Ivanka proves that the president's daughter converted to Judaism, and she's still the president's daughter, and her husband seems to be with Steve Witkoff, trying to make peace in the world. And so therefore, it doesn't seem to be that, that you're going to be held back in America by converting to Judaism. But let's go back to October 7th. And I didn't know that about the Holocaust, but that's fascinating. So one hand, there are some non-Jews who identified with Jews after October 7th, but that's not actually the test group. The test group, like Professor G.D. Cresson, are people who were connected to Jews, but who did not convert for whatever reason. Obviously, everybody has their own story. For whatever reason. And after October 7th, it shook something inside of them that said that I need to identify Jewish. The cases I had were very often the following. The 18-year-old Israeli, Miriam, who decides they don't want to fight in the army. They come to America. They want to do two things. They want to make $1 billion and they want to marry a pretty non-Jewish American blonde. Those are two things that they want. I don't know whether they make $1 billion. That's not my department. But what happened was that, so they meet the nice American woman and they're not interested in their Judaism anymore. So, I don't know, they do get married, they don't get married, whatever the case may be, the non-Jew remains not Jewish. But after October 7th, all of a sudden there was a crisis. Because their boyfriends, their partners, their husbands, all of a sudden, number one, had the question about whether to go back to Israel to serve in the IDF. the IDF that they rejected, all of a sudden Israel's at risk. Now, Mir, maybe we need to go back to the IDF. So whether they decided to go back or they didn't go back, this became an issue in their relationship. And so all of a sudden, Israel and Judaism and identification all of a sudden are reborn in these couples in which he tried to, push it under the bed for all that time. And I had literally several dozen of these types of cases. And in some cases, the guy went back to Israel to fight in the army. In some cases, he went through some internal crisis, but he decided not to go back. But instead of going back, he decided that she had to convert and they wanted to create Jewish children. It's not exactly what you're talking about in terms of the Holocaust, but it's related in the sense that, that sometimes you have a surprising reaction. So what we read about in the newspaper is the fact that, oh my goodness, October 7th led to, to Columbia University and all the anti-Jewish feeling and all pro-Palestinian, all of that. But there's another book that needs to be written about people who found their Jewish identity. And all I'm arguing is it's not people from the street. It's not people who had no connection to Judaism. It's people who had a connection. Jeannie Suk Gerson was married to a Jewish guy. She was divorced from that Jewish guy. She was married to a second Jewish guy, and she had not converted. She was as Jewish could be. In her home, Miriam, she ran the Seder. She had two Jewish husbands, and in both of those relationships, she ran the Seder. But she didn't convert for whatever personal reasons. She didn't convert. But after October 7th, that wasn't good enough anymore.
Well, the same, Miriam, we heard a story, a very moving story from a woman who her children had gone to day school. The children were converted in Orthodox conversions when she had children. She was a minister. I'm talking about Eleanor Bregman. What she described was so touching. What she said was she was in a conversation. She worked at a synagogue. She had never converted. And the conversation was people were talking about October 7th. And it struck her that it had happened to her. Not that she was a Christian woman who had a Jewish husband and Jewish children who were impacted by October 7th. But it's as if that experience, that trauma, revealed to her that her essential self really was already Jewish, and therefore she chose to formalize it with a conversion. But I found that extremely touching. She said, it didn't happen to them. It also happened to me. And that's when I realized, why am I not converting? I'm Jewish. This is who I am, which is sort of a little different from what Adam is saying. But I guess the history, either, Miriam, you're going to have to write that book, or historians looking back on this time, may have something different to say. I have to say, going back just for a moment to the beginning of our conversation, one of the things I found so tragic in Portugal when we went to the synagogue in Lisbon, and you see the names, et cetera, of the families. But once there were and you'll know this, I'm just the tourist who bought this necklace, as a fool. But the number of Jews who were before the Inquisition living in Portugal, and then after the Inquisition, it seems there were enormous amounts of conversion. And then suddenly over time, even the crypto Jews, I've read and I've heard so many stories of people who kept, you hear this all the time, they lit candles, they didn't know why, or they didn't eat pork, they didn't know why. So I'd like to understand the people who converted out by force or went underground. Ultimately, what does that do to their Judaism? It's like the reverse in a way.
That's a huge question, but I actually would like to get back to, and I'll address it as well as I can, but get back to what Adam said. I understand that you're involved with couples. That's a major part of what you do. But if you ask me the question, what do I foresee happening in the long term? I don't think the shift we're watching is an ephemeral one. That the golden age may be just over, and we've been watching it build, and I've certainly seen it in my own experience, both anti-Semitism not connected with Israel and anti anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian sentiments that, that they may or may not be anti-Semitic, but they create a certain image of Israel, and Israel is intimately connected with Jews. So I do wonder whether that will, if you ask me about the future, whether that will impact on people's readiness if they're at the fringes, either to enter into a marriage with a Jew or to convert on their own. I don't know, but I think it's a possibility.
I'll just say, Miriam, first of all, this has been a fascinating conversation. Everybody make sure to get your book, Conversion by Miriam Bodian, and to go to JTS 122nd Street and Broadway and see an amazing exhibition and see the illustration in Warder Cresson's book. And you'll know more than anybody else there about the story of Warder Cresson.
When does it run until, Miriam? When does the exhibition run?
I think 3 months, right?
It's June till June.
Oh, June, more than 3 months. You have plenty of time, but go quickly. It's better early. I just would say, and this is also for another conversation, you're right. The Israel piece is very complicated, both for anti-Semitism reasons and internally within Israel, that Israel is not broadly or embracing American converts to Judaism. So what's happened with converts is that they convert to Judaism. They may actually be totally Orthodox, but Israel is not on their radar because they'll have a problem if they go to Israel, because they won't be able to be married in Israel, because there'll be a question about whether or not they can become citizens in Israel. That's a huge problem, which is terrible. So these people are converting to committed Judaism, in some cases because of October 7th, yet the idea of Israel going forward is something that they don't know how to tackle because there are so many complications, both again, externally and internally. I think that there's definitely, Meredith, a need for a conversation about that. That's a huge problem. I feel it.
The historical problem is it's not easy to be a Jew, right? That's both the challenge and the joy and the beauty of being Jewish. It's complex. I mean, that's why these conversations, Miriam, thank you so much for sharing all of your historical knowledge. It is fascinating and important, and we're very grateful.
To be continued. There's so much more. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.